So for the last project that you're going to do, you're going to be considering an experiment or experiments in abstraction. This notion of stepping away from, representing an object or people or things as they look. Instead, coming away and determining how shapes and forms and colors can influence our perception or our thoughts about a painting or a work of art. Of course, when we're dealing with abstraction, you can pull from elements of the real, of the representing reality, but we don't want to represent things the way we have been in our previous paintings. Here's some examples of some student work where colors are playing off of each other to push themselves closer to the middle while this kind of lighter or wider area expands out. Using this kind of reds, cadmium reds, the ultramarines and some of the yellows, but using them in these tinted areas here, so it's not just a stark white, but it borrows from these colors, so there's kind of a harmony that's happening, even as they kind of careen towards the center and then explode out. And these are ways we can talk about such things like abstraction. There's a whole history of abstraction in the lecture, and the things that I talk about in the lecture and in the PowerPoint gets into how we arrive at this point of where art can be made this way. And it's been ongoing, for over centuries, over a century and a half, almost. So we have this way of looking at it. That's one element there, that one painting that someone did. There are other ways too here, right, where we can have this kind of hard edge for the shapes and the forms within the painting. What's interesting here is I know when the student made this, they kind of used tape. They painted everything this kind of off black. They'd mixed their own black. Then they taped off areas. Then they painted other colors to arrive at this very interesting way that shapes and forms and lines are moving. And that's another thing too, we're dealing with abstraction. In essence, part of what we want to do, as with anything, when we're making something that's visually interesting, is why should we look at this and what's happening within this picture that creates the interest for us to look at it, right? Something else that was done here. It's going to be this way or that way. Not so bad, not so good. But one of the things I want to point out is you can obviously use your ruler to make straight lines and forms, geometric forms, if you want to. The interesting thing about this is that we come here to the center where it's this yellow with this black, right? It's like a bullseye. And these larger areas of color kind of try to pull us away from just being in that dead center area, all right? What could make this a more interesting painting is that we could have variations. Notice all of these colors are as if they were squeezed out of the tube, fully intense. Playing around with the variations of what can happen with colors very often allows for a variety for our own viewing pleasure as we're looking at something. Again, if these were all this bright and intense, then what would happen to this? This is lighter, and yet it brings some of those colors tinted in there, so it allows for some visual variety that way. Well, this is something here using three primaries to arrive at a painting, an abstract painting here, just using geometric forms. So what you should do is, what I recommend is taking a little piece of paper first, or an even smaller piece of paper, if you have a smaller sheet of paper, whatever. I have a larger sheet, but I fold this in half here like that, and just do a little, plans possibly for what you might want to do. Obviously, you can take a pencil, you can take a ruler. It might be, if we're thinking about our canvas here, that you want to deal with round forms, organic forms, or shapes. And what do I want to do with this as I go along here is I can go ahead then here with this and consider the colors that I want to use, right? Now, I don't know what could work or not, but I do know that if I were to take some darker colors here, and what I have done here now is I am using some of the colors that I liked from that portrait painting, and I like to use some of those, and I made up my own black because I want a darker color there. And just real quick, just to do this, is I can just kind of think about, before I get to my canvas, think about what happens if this is darker up here. So you can see what I'm doing here is showing you how I can just, working with abstraction, like anything else, doesn't mean that it's not planned. Although, once you get down to it and allow yourself to kind of get into a groove of painting, that might become the case. I like the fact, though, here as I'm just showing you some of this, that if I have a darker area here, that's going to balance out here. I don't want this to be so light as I'm thinking about it, because what if I float away from what's happening here? So maybe I could make sure I repeat that dark here and bring it around that way. So in this sense, what I've done is dark, dark. I've stopped from just coming off the thing here. Now as I decide what my colors might be here, I can begin to think about some visual interest that can happen if I change the nature of the colors, I change their intensity or their value as I go along. So that's one way to just quickly plan without wasting paint, about thinking about what could work in terms of the design, right? If I take my canvas now here, I know I've thought about that in terms of it being horizontal. You see there are thoughts that I'm bringing into this as I go along. I personally don't tend to work without thinking about what I'm doing with this. Some people really get involved as though it's like jazz kind of free form and kind of jamming. But there are many ways that you can approach this. Again, I can bring the pencil to the canvas. I could have drawn elements. Remember what we're not doing. What we're not doing is we're not drawing cats or trees or houses or cars. You can reference some of those elements, right? I have here some of this color that I liked from the portrait painting, right? So I know I was looking at my plan here, but if I'm thinking about as I'm painting this, kind of rolling forms here, and this flesh color here, or at least the flesh tone I was using for myself, can allow the viewer to bring in some of those thoughts as to what that might mean. Again, remember I had done part of what my plan was, and now I'm kind of letting go of that, but considering some of these things as I'm painting. As that comes into that, like that. Now, I don't know, as I'm looking at this, remembering what I had these kind of rolling areas here. I can take some of this color, and I like to show you here, you see how that's really smoothly moving on that. I can dip that in some water. Remember when you had made the toned canvas at the very beginning? Not all of this has to be thick applications of paint, right? You can stain part of that canvas, right, with some of that color. I can come in and I can emphasize some of these lines as I continue. And again, for me, I'm just kind of now loosely following what this plan I thought about with these kind of rolling forms as feeling of landscape or body and just round forms that play off of that. I could play off of that by having changed my mind entirely and I could start to have some hard edge as I'm working that way. So there are all sorts of possibilities here as you're doing this. Again, when I was planning initially, I'm like, okay, what happens if I'm working with that? Forms this way, forms that way, coming back. But I'm allowing myself some of this improvisation as I'm going along, as I'm painting, right? And I think what that allows you to do is tap into kind of intuitive moments you might have that very often don't happen when we're painting from observation, where we have to consider what we're looking at as we paint. Now, it doesn't mean that maybe I'd like that to be a little lighter. Pull the eye up to that. Like that. It doesn't mean that we might not reference things that exist in real time. Again, the notion of a round form can mean a lot of different things, right? It can be the tire of a car, right? It can be the repetitive forms of tires that are moving as we see things on the day-to-day on the highway, right? It can be that. It can be a lot of those things. But what we're not doing is making paintings of that. I might want to reference the notion of the human form within this round kind of tire form that I was thinking. We are humans, we're driving as we move. And so this is the possibility, while now you see I'm bringing this color over to here to allow for a balance. Again, thinking about what that initial thought was there for my idea as it starts to become a little bit of its own form here. So, you know, I'm doing this and I'm really getting kind of caught up in what I'm trying to do for my own painting here, changing this color somewhat here of what might be variations of flesh tones or human tones, and maybe I'm seeing the human form as I'm doing these without painting the human form, right? And that's one of these other ways when we look at early abstraction where people let go of looking at the representational forms while still relying on some of those forms, you know, to support their ideas for the paintings that they were making. You're going to be making your own paintings. I showed you some examples. There are plenty of examples throughout history. I started to make a painting right here that I started to get involved with and have some fun with. Right? Fantasy, things that are beyond reality, can certainly be a part of what's happening with these paintings. Elements that are pulled in from life. can certainly be a part of what happens with these paintings, right? A set of eyeballs here, a set of eyes that are looking out at us as we paint that form. I don't know, we can bring some elements of humor into what happens with these things. An eye without a face there, right? And we can build up this darker area if we want to while that paint is still wet. I don't know, maybe it's looking at something. But you know, this notion of allowing oneself to get away from representing objects or looking at things in reality as we build up an image is a part of what this project is about. So obviously what I don't want you to do is provide me a painting that is just like what we've been doing with still life or with portrait, right? Get away from that. Think of shape and form. Think about how you can develop an interesting picture using a variety of ways that you can manipulate color and shape using your brush.